Flesh is temporary, but form is eternal. That's what Ilara Verdin always told herself. Her studio, a place that once buzzed with life, now reeked of dust and solvents. A cathedral filled with unfinished bodies. Marble torsos leaned against the walls like ghosts caught in a final breath. Fine white powder floated through the air like pale ash, coating everything, including Ilara herself. Her hands were permanently white from sanding, and she began to notice her own skin taking on a faint, stony hue. It's just the residue of beauty, she thought. Ilara was a prodigy, the youngest sculptor to ever win the prestigious Granton Prize. Critics raved that her statues seemed to breathe, that she captured human vitality with an uncanny, almost supernatural skill. But lately, that magic was fading. A tremor had found its way into her fingers, and the clay felt dead beneath her touch. Her old mentor had warned her, "Your touch is losing its warmth, Ilara. Be careful not to chase the impossible." But she couldn't stop. The perfection she once glimpsed in marble now felt impossibly distant, slipping further away with each passing day. It all began with a desperate experiment. While poring over ancient texts, Ilara discovered an obscure Renaissance practice, artists inhaling powdered marble to commune with the stone. It sounded like madness, pure superstition. But the idea lodged itself in her mind. If marble was the very essence of immortality, maybe it just needed a way to get inside her, to flow through her veins. And so, she did it. She ground a handful of pristine Carrara dust into her morning tea. The first time, she felt nothing but a raw, chalky taste at the back of her throat. The second time, a strange, tingling sensation lingered in her fingertips for hours. By the third cup, she swore she could hear faint vibrations humming through the studio walls, as if the statues were whispering to her through the very stone they were made of. Her latest work, a masterpiece she called Eros Dying, had become her sole obsession. It was a male figure, half reclined, one hand reaching towards the heavens. She couldn't decide if he was ascending into glory or sinking into oblivion. No matter how many times she chipped and chiseled, the expression remained lifeless. She craved transcendence, a face caught in that fleeting, perfect moment between agony and beauty. Then she started to bleed into her work, quite literally. One morning, her knuckles split open against the chisel. On a strange, sudden impulse, she smeared the crimson blood across the statue's marble chest. It dried, fading from a stark red to a pale, delicate rose. The very next day, the grain of the stone beneath her touch felt different. It felt warmer. She told no one about this, of course, but late at night, when the city was quiet, she would press her palm against the chest of Eros and swear she could feel a faint rhythmic pulse, like a sleeping heart. The changes in her own body came slowly at first. Her hands, once soft, were now constantly cold and hard to the touch. The veins on her arms turned a pale bluish white, looking more and more like the natural veins that run through a block of marble. She stopped wearing gloves, wanting to watch the transformation unfold. When she carved, she felt the vibration of the chisel not just in her hands, but resonating deep within her, as though her very bones were singing in harmony with the stone. Others began to notice. Her assistant Mara stared at her one afternoon, a look of concern on her face. "You look carved," she said softly. Ilara just laughed it off. "Occupational hazard," she replied, her voice a little too brittle. But later that night, as she touched her own face in the mirror, she felt no soft give of flesh beneath her fingertips, just a smooth, unyielding coolness, like polished alabaster. Sleep became a stranger to her. Every creak and groan of the old studio sounded alive, purposeful. She eventually drifted off on the floor, curled up beside Eros Dying. In her dreams, she saw marble dust swirling through her lungs like a blizzard, coating her heart in a cold, gleaming crust. And in that dream, she awoke inside the statue, and the statue breathed. By the 5th week, the transformation was undeniable. Her skin seemed to shimmer in the daylight, and her pupils had clouded over into a murky gray. She started hiding behind long sleeves and scarves, blaming exhaustion when concerned friends came to visit. The sensation of hunger had dulled to a distant memory. Food felt foreign, unnecessary. The only thing that thrilled her now was the rhythmic song of hammer and chisel, the vibration that traveled up her arms and into her very core. She was being sculpted from the inside out. The marble dust in her tea was no longer enough. She began injecting it, mixing tiny suspensions of powdered calcium carbonate and introducing them directly into her bloodstream. The first injections burned like acid, but they were always followed by a profound, almost euphoric calm. She called it the communion. Her art transformed along with her body. The figures she carved became impossibly lifelike. You could see the delicate veins beneath their translucent marble skin, their eyes brimming with a wet, captured sorrow. Critics called her new work uncannily organic, completely unaware of how literal that description had become. And Eros dying. Well, it was no longer dying. One morning, Ilara walked into her studio and saw condensation misting the statue's chest, as if it had just exhaled a warm breath. She ran her fingers along its ribs. They were faintly warm. A wave of dizziness washed over her. As she stumbled back, her hand left a perfect, fleeting imprint in the marble. Heat against heat. "Ilara!" A frightened voice whispered from the doorway. It was Mara. "You should see a doctor." Ilara turned, but for a terrifying moment her jaw wouldn't move. Her skin had tightened overnight, and she could feel a faint crack spiderwebbing along her cheekbone. When she finally spoke, a fine dust of stone flaked from her lips. "I'm fine." The doctors, of course, were baffled. They said her calcium levels were impossibly high, her bone density beyond any measurable limit. They threw around terms like calcification disorders, autoimmune responses, and rare pathologies. She barely listened. To her, this wasn't a diagnosis, it was evidence of her success. "The body resists transformation," she whispered to her reflection in the polished surface of a new sculpture. "But art endures." At night, she began sanding her own arms with fine grit paper, smoothing away any remaining roughness until her skin gleamed under the moonlight. Pain had left her completely. She even tested it once, pressing a chisel against her own thigh. The steel tool snapped clean in two. She felt only a dull, hollow vibration, like striking stone. When Eros dying was finally unveiled, it sent shockwaves through the art world. The statue didn't just look alive, it was alive. Its chest seemed to rise and fall in an imperceptible rhythm. Its eyes shimmered with a constant moisture, and the veins beneath its surface pulsed faintly under the gallery lights. Crowds flocked to see it. Critics called it divine, uncanny, a miracle. But Ilara wasn't at the opening. She couldn't have gone, even if she'd wanted to. That morning, her legs had fused stiffly, her knees refusing to bend. Her veins no longer carried blood, but something thicker, a slow, mineral-rich slurry. Her heartbeats were faint and far between, echoing in her chest like distant hammer strikes on stone. Mara found her hours later, seated on a stool before the now famous statue, whispering to it. "You're complete now," Ilara murmured, her voice a dry rasp. "You've taken what I couldn't give on my own." Mara rushed to her side and tried to help her up, but Ilara's body had fused to the stool. She felt impossibly heavy, impossibly dense. When Mara touched her shoulder, a flake of skin came away like a chip of marble. "Ilara, please!" But the sculptor just smiled, a serene, cracking expression. Her eyes were turning completely white. "It's perfect," she whispered. They found her a week later, perfectly still, a statue of herself, seated beside Eros dying, the two figures facing one another in an eternal silent conversation. The autopsy, or what passed for one, revealed traces of marble dust in every petrified organ, her bones denser than granite. The art world mourned the loss of a genius, never knowing the true price of her final masterpiece. No one could ever explain how the two statues, the artist and her creation, shared the exact same set of fingerprints. Now, when the museum lights dim and the crowds have all gone home, the night guards sometimes swear they hear faint grinding sounds from that gallery, like stone shifting against stone. The air, they say, grows thick with the faint, chalky smell of marble dust. And if you lean in close enough to feel the chill coming off the stone, the statue of Elara Verdin seems to exhale. Mara always said that color had a pulse. She didn't just see it, she felt it. When she painted, she thought in terms of temperature. How ochre throbbed like a low fever. How cerulean blue exhaled a cool breath. Her studio was her sanctuary, smelling of linseed oil and turpentine, filled with canvases that felt more alive than tranquil. She painted hills that looked like muscle, skies that strained against some invisible weight. Her hands were never truly clean. A faint blush of red or yellow always remained under her nails, as if the paint had seeped right into her bloodstream. It was easy to dismiss the rash at first. Just a small, dry circle of irritation on her wrist, pale pink. She figured it was a reaction to a new solvent, nothing more. But within days, that small patch darkened, first to rose, then a deep violet, and finally, a bruised, unsettling indigo. The strangest part? It didn't hurt. It just spread. By the end of the week, a delicate bloom of color climbed her forearm in intricate veins. She stood in front of the mirror, tracing them with her finger. They looked like tiny, branching brushstrokes. There was an odd beauty to it, a soft marbling under her skin, like the first blush of dawn. She told herself not to worry. Artists always sacrifice a piece of themselves for their art. Splinters, burns, the constant fumes. This was just her body, reminding her of her devotion. Her next painting came almost too easily. She woke abruptly at 3 a.m, an image seared into her mind, a field of pale, serene figures standing shoulder-deep in wildflowers, their faces tilted toward the sky as if they were rooted to the spot. She painted in a trance until the sun came up. When she finally stepped back to look at her work, her breath hitched in her throat. The flowers she'd painted, they were the exact same unnatural violet as the rash on her arm. A color that shimmered and shifted when you turned your head, as if it were alive. She couldn't remember mixing that specific shade at all. That day, she noticed the hum. It started beneath her skin, a low vibration, a faint buzzing that seemed to match the rhythm of her brushstrokes. Whenever she stopped painting, the feeling would dull, but the moment she picked up her brush again, it surged back, stronger than before. She started wearing long sleeves, despite the suffocating heat of the studio. The colors on her arm were no longer just veins. They had deepened into hypnotic swirls, blooming like ink dropped in water. At night, she dreamt of roots threading through her veins, anchoring her to her bed. Finally, she went to a doctor. She struggled to find the right words. "It's spreading," she said, nervously rolling up her sleeve. "But it's not painful." The doctor frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "It looks vascular," he muttered. "Maybe vasculitis or—" He trailed off, pressing his stethoscope to her wrist. He went still, then paused. "What is it?" she asked, her own pulse starting to race. He listened again. "There's a sound." "A sound? What kind of sound?" He hesitated, looking at her strangely. "Like movement." He ordered tests, but they were useless. The blood samples clotted almost instantly, the tubes showing faint, separated layers of color, as if the blood itself had been tinted. They referred her to a specialist. She never made the appointment. She had a commission due, a major gallery piece she was calling Inheritance. The concept was transformation, how beauty often carries decay hidden within it. She felt she understood that concept intimately now. Her work became feverish. She painted faster than she ever had before, filling canvas after canvas with visceral organic forms, petals that looked like flesh, coral that branched like veins. Each piece was more vivid than the last. She barely looked in the mirror anymore, but when she did, she saw her skin shifting day by day. Patches of pale gold bloomed along her neck, soft pink along her ribs. She wasn't frightened anymore. She was fascinated. One night, while cleaning her tools, she nicked her palm with a palette knife. She braced for the sting, for the sight of blood. But it didn't bleed red. Instead, a translucent, shimmering fluid oozed from the cut like heavily diluted paint. She watched, mesmerized, as it beaded on her skin before drying into a faint, iridescent film of color. Her breath quickened. An idea, wild and dangerous, took hold. She pressed her clean finger into a jar of titanium white, then mixed a single drop of the fluid from her palm into the paint. She brushed the mixture onto a test canvas. The white stroke glowed. It was rich, vibrant, and pulsed with a light more alive than anything she'd ever mixed before. When she leaned in close, she was certain of it. The painted line pulsed with a faint, steady rhythm. Her condition evolved. The colors threaded through her entire body now, faint but undeniable. Her skin resembled marble veined with pastel. She started moving differently, slower, more deliberate, as if she were afraid to smudge herself. The buzzing inside her became a constant companion, a sound only she could hear. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, it almost sounded like whispering. She tried to record it on her phone, but the playback was just static and silence. Her world narrowed to the four walls of her studio. Food lost its taste, sleep lost its meaning. Only the painting mattered. Each canvas felt less like a creation and more like a confession. She no longer sketched. She felt like she was bleeding the images directly onto the canvas. In one painting, a human figure dissolved into a cascade of petals. In another, the veins of a hand sprouted tendrils that reached for the sky, flowering into impossible blossoms. With every finished piece, she felt weaker, but also strangely lighter, as if she were transferring a part of herself, her very essence, into the work. The bloom, the infection, whatever it was, didn't stop at her skin. She could feel it in her breath now, her lungs filling with a strange floral warmth. When she exhaled onto a cold pane of glass, faint, colored patterns spread across it, like intricate frost. June, her curator and oldest friend, finally grew worried enough to visit unannounced. The moment she saw Mara, she covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Mara!" she gasped. "My God! What happened to you?" Mara just smiled faintly, a serene, distant look in her eyes. "I'm changing," she said, her voice soft. "Isn't it beautiful?" June's gaze darted around the studio. The canvases seemed to glow in the dim light, not just reflecting it, but generating their own faint luminescence, a soft pulse that seemed to beat in time with Mara's heart. "Please," June whispered, taking a step forward. "Mara, you need help." "I have it." Mara gestured to the paintings surrounding them. "They help me. They are me." When June reached out to grab her arm, Mara recoiled instinctively. But it was too late. Her skin had brushed against June's sleeve, leaving a streak of brilliant violet. June cried out, not in pain, but in shock. The fabric of her jacket hissed, the color bleeding outward from the point of contact, spreading like a vivid ink stain. They stared at each other in horror. "Don't touch me," Mara said quietly, her voice trembling. "I'm not safe." After June left, shaken and terrified, Mara locked the studio door. She didn't unlock it again. days and nights blurred into one long, continuous act of creation. Her canvases multiplied, covering every wall, leaning against each other in colorful forests. In the dark, the colors seemed to breathe, and she swore she could hear them whispering to each other. The bloom had long since consumed her body. Her hair had faded to a shimmering silver, her pupils were ringed with gold. She no longer felt hunger or thirst, only the constant thrumming pulse of creation. She began one final piece. She didn't plan it. Her hands simply knew what they had to do. It was a self-portrait. She moved as if guided by an unseen force, layer upon layer of glowing pigment, until a figure emerged from the canvas. Skin blooming with impossible color, veins threaded with pure light. The face looked alive. It looked like it was breathing. When she finally stepped back, the world swam. The hum inside her reached a deafening crescendo. She looked at her reflection in the wet paint of the portrait. It shimmered, and then it smiled back at her. And then it moved. Weeks later, when the gallery staff finally broke down the door to her studio, the air inside didn't smell of turpentine and decay. It smelled sweet, like a field of wildflowers in full bloom. The studio was filled with silent, beautiful canvases, all except one. The final painting, Inheritance, covered the entire back wall. It depicted a woman dissolving into a field of radiant flowers, her body composed of pure, living pigment, her expression one of perfect peace. There was no sign of Mara, only a faint residue on the floor, thin, iridescent streaks of color, like footprints walking directly into the painting and never returning. They say that if you visit the gallery and look at the painting under just the right light, you can still see the pigment shifting, petal by petal, vein by vein, as if the painting is still and forever blooming. Lena had always believed that a sculpture was a body that remembered how to breathe. When her chisel kissed marble, she imagined the veins beneath the stone, the ribs that might still rise, the lips that might whisper. At just 29, her studio was already a forest of human forms, torsos reaching for light, faces locked in longing. Critics called her a conjurer of motion. She liked that. Motion, the illusion of life. But lately, she could feel a stillness creeping into her own fingers. They stiffened after long nights, tendons buzzing like taut wires. Her knuckles swelled, not painfully but insistently, as if something inside wanted more room. She blamed it on overwork. Sculptors always live somewhere between ache and ambition. Still, the stiffness unsettled her. She tried stretches, heat packs, yoga. Nothing helped. Each morning, her reflection looked a little paler, a little less present. Her skin had the dull gleam of unpolished stone. Then came the sound. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a pressure in the air, the memory of a hammer strike. Whenever she looked at one of her unfinished figures, she could sense it, a low hum that wasn't heard but felt. It drew her closer. One night, she stood before a marble woman she'd been carving for weeks. The piece was half done, its torso twisting, its face still hidden in the block. Lena touched the cool surface, intending to map the next cut, but the hum rose in her chest, echoing her own heartbeat. For a moment, she could swear the marble was warm. She pulled her hand away, startled. Her palm left a faint damp print like condensation. She turned on all the studio lights, laughing nervously at herself, at her tired imagination. But the humor didn't last. When she looked again, her fingerprint had hardened in place, an exact fossil of her skin, tiny ridges and all, fused into the stone. Over the next few days, she couldn't stay away from that sculpture. She named it Stillness. Each touch seemed to wake something in it. The marble no longer resisted her tools. It yielded almost eagerly, smooth and pliant. She stopped wearing gloves. The skin on her fingertips roughened to a chalky white, but she told herself it was just dust. At night, her dreams filled with the whisper of grinding stone. She dreamed she was carving her own arm, shaping it into perfect symmetry. She would wake to find faint scratches there, fine and deliberate, as if traced by a delicate blade. Her friends started to notice her isolation. "You need a break, Lena," said June, another artist who shared the building. "You look brittle." Lena just laughed it off. But after June left, Lena stood before the mirror for a long time. Under the harsh studio lights, her skin caught the glow of alabaster. When she pressed a fingernail into her forearm, the dent stayed, slow to fade, like modeling clay. She began avoiding mirrors after that. Work became a trance. Days blurred together without meals or phone calls. Her studio smelled of dust, sweat, and something faintly metallic. She started hearing that hum everywhere, through her tools, in her very bones. Her sculptures seemed to breathe with her. Sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, she caught the marble woman tilting ever so slightly, as if shifting her weight to one foot. The first real fracture happened a week later. She was sanding stillness, smoothing the line of its shoulder, when the file slipped and scraped her wrist. The skin peeled back cleanly, revealing not blood, but a pale, matte material beneath, granular like stone. She stared, frozen, then pressed her thumb over it. The wound didn't bleed. It crumbled, the edges flaking into a fine powder. She just wrapped the spot and kept working. By dawn, she couldn't tell where her dust ended and the sculptures began. She stopped going home. The studio became her cocoon. When June came knocking again, Lena didn't answer. Through the door, she insisted she was fine, just working. June left a thermos of soup. Lena left it untouched until it cooled into a solid, unappetizing gel. Her transformation was accelerating. Her fingers fused with callus. Her arms stiffened into the perfect tension of a dancer's pose. She no longer felt hunger or thirst, only the slow, deep pulse of the hum guiding her hands. One morning, she realized the marble woman's face looked exactly like hers. The resemblance wasn't planned. She hadn't sculpted a self-portrait in years. Yet there it was. The same cheekbones, the same small scar above the brow from a childhood fall. She studied it, awed and deeply uneasy. Had she been subconsciously shaping herself all along? She stepped closer until their noses nearly touched. The air between them trembled. Her fingertips brushed the statue's lips. The hum swelled into a powerful chorus. "Breathe," she whispered, and stillness did. A faint exhale brushed Lena's face, warm and damp. The marble woman's eyes opened, grey, depthless, but undeniably aware. Lena stumbled back. The figure took one slow, cracking step forward, as if freeing itself from centuries of sleep. Chunks of marble sloughed off its body to reveal flesh the color of moonlight. Lena tried to scream, but her jaw refused to move. Her skin hardened from her throat to her chin, locking the sound inside. She reached out, but her arm froze mid-motion, caught in a pose of perfect grace. Her breath caught in her chest and held. The living statue approached, mirroring her pose. For a single heartbeat they stood face to face, one flesh becoming stone, the other stone becoming flesh. The hum resolved into words she couldn't quite hear, but she understood their meaning. We are complete. Then, darkness. When June finally forced the studio door open, the room was silent except for the wind whistling through broken windows. The sculptures stood where they always had, though something about them felt different, more alive, more watchful. In the center of the room stood stillness, two intertwined figures, one holding the other in an almost tender embrace. Lena was nowhere to be found. Critics would later call Stillness her masterpiece, a dialogue between creator and creation. They marveled at its precision, the uncanny detail of the veins, the pores, the faint asymmetry that made it feel so human. No one could explain how the sculpture's eyes seemed to glisten, or why its surface stayed faintly warm to the touch, as if it remembered the heat of living hands. June sometimes visits the studio after hours. She swears that when the lights dim, she can hear a low vibration, like breath trapped inside stone. And once, just once, she thought she saw the statue move, just slightly, as if shifting its weight from one foot to the other. The city of Vassal was still reeling. Even though Dermatech had gone dark, the whispers lingered, stories of living skin, of people who just disappeared. The company's buildings stood empty, monuments to a scandal that had scarred the city. But the technology, their dangerous science, it didn't die with the company. It scattered, festering in black market labs and private experiments, a time bomb waiting to go off. Eli Moran couldn't have cared less. He was a field biologist, a man of the earth. His world was growth, the slow, steady rhythm of nature, not the Frankenstein-like creation of geneticists. He studied what was, not what could be forced into existence. He was content in his quiet world of soil and sunlight, far from the city's ghosts, until the forest itself began to change. The call came from a mining company, their operations grinding to a halt near the northern ridges. The site manager sounded strained, talking about a strange moss that had taken over their camp, a vibrant, almost glowing green that was spreading impossibly fast, even across cold metal and sterile plastic. She said it appeared overnight, swallowing everything. For Eli, it was a biological puzzle he couldn't resist. He arrived as a storm broke, his SUV's tires crunching over roots that had already buckled and split the asphalt road. The forest loomed over him, unnaturally tall and eerily quiet, the rain sliding off the leaves like thin, greasy oil. The air felt heavy, watchful. Inside the mining camp, the scene was surreal. Everything was coated in a blanket of that pulsating green moss, trucks, fences, even the workers' discarded tools. It seemed to pulse with a faint internal light, as if it were breathing in the humid air. "Christ," Eli murmured, his scientific curiosity warring with a primal sense of dread. The site manager, a pale woman with smudges of dirt on her cheeks, stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of exhaustion and fear. "You're the third scientist they've sent this month," she said, her voice flat. "The others, they didn't last." Eli's brow furrowed. "Didn't last? What does that mean?" Her gaze drifted towards the unnerving woods. "They wouldn't stop scratching," she explained. "Said they felt something crawling under their skin. Then they just left, walked off into the trees. We never saw them again." A cold tendril of unease began to crawl up Eli's own spine. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the work, collecting samples of the bizarre moss. Back in the makeshift lab, he placed a specimen under the microscope. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cells were all wrong. Instead of a single orderly nucleus, each cell contained several, all dividing in a chaotic, frenzied sync. It was spreading like an out-of-control cancer, a growth that refused to die, that didn't follow any known biological rules. He set up his camera to document the anomaly, but just as he was about to take a photo, the power flickered. The generator outside whined and sputtered. When the light steadied, he saw movement in the petri dish. It wasn't the moss anymore. Tiny, thread-like filaments were writhing within the sample, reaching for the edge of the glass. He leaned closer, mesmerized and horrified. The threads brushed against the barrier, paused, and then pierced right through it. Eli jerked back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The filament slithered out onto the lab bench, stretching toward his hand like a sentient vine seeking purchase. With a choked gasp, he slammed an empty glass jar over it and scrambled away from the table. "What the hell? What is this stuff?" That night, sleep offered no escape. The rain had stopped, but the wind had picked up, carrying strange, whispering sounds through the trees. The very walls of his small cabin seemed to hum, with that same faint, rhythmic pulse he'd seen in the moss. He felt a phantom itch on his hand and looked down. A tiny green splinter was clinging to his palm, probably from one of the samples. He tried to brush it off, but it wouldn't budge. Annoyed, he scrubbed at it with his thumb. Instead of coming off, the splinter seemed to sink into his flesh, disappearing beneath the surface like a drop of ink bleeding into paper. A deep, dull throb of pain followed almost immediately. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his breathing ragged. "It's fine," he muttered to the empty room, trying to convince himself. "It's just a splinter, it's nothing." But the throbbing grew stronger, a heavy pulse that began to sync up with his own frantic heartbeat. When he finally succumbed to exhaustion, his dreams were a terrifying landscape of roots. They grew through his veins, thick and fibrous, wrapping around his bones, anchoring him to the earth. A chorus of whispers, like the rustling of a billion leaves, filled his mind with a single chilling thought. "You're soil now." He woke with a start before dawn, the sound of scratching echoing in the silence. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside him. Stumbling to the small mirror in the corner, Eli stared at his reflection in horror. The veins in his arms were no longer blue. They were a dark, sickly green. Tiny bulges moved beneath his skin, crawling along the new dark pathways. When he pressed a finger against one, he felt something shift, something firm and alive. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice trembling. He grabbed for the radio, desperate to call for help, for an evac, for anyone. But the speaker only hissed back, with dead, empty static. The forest was cutting him off. He looked out the window. The trees were alive, their leaves trembling and shaking, though there was no wind. He knew he had to find the mining team. He grabbed his field knife and a heavy-duty flashlight and burst out of the cabin, his mind racing. He found their camp just as he'd left it, but now it was utterly empty. The tents were torn open from the inside, thick roots winding through sleeping bags and around abandoned boots. A slow, deliberate movement in the shadows caught his eye. He swung his flashlight beam towards it. A man stood there, shirtless, his skin cracked and textured like the bark of an ancient tree. A thick, vibrant moss grew from his empty eye sockets. He opened his mouth to speak, but a torrent of green vines spilled out instead. "Help! Me!" the thing croaked, its voice a wet, gurgling sound before its body collapsed into a writhing heap of crawling green matter. Eli didn't wait to see more. He ran. He sprinted back toward his SUV, his only way out, his lungs burning, but the vehicle was already being consumed. Thick vines covered the doors and windows, the metal of the frame visibly warped and bent. When he grabbed the handle to wrench it open, it came off in his hand, slick with a thick, sticky sap. Panic, pure and undiluted, surged through him. He spun back toward the lab, his last hope for shelter, but it was gone. In its place stood a massive, pulsating mound of roots and earth, a living heart that was slowly swallowing the last remains of the camp. A voice whispered directly behind him, soft as shifting soil. "Don't fight it." He whipped around. The site manager stood there, or what was left of her. Her hair had become a tangled mass of living vines, and blooming flowers, beautiful and terrifying, grew where her eyes should have been. "They said it came from your people," she murmured, her voice a gentle, melodic hum. "Your science, your Dermatech." Eli shook his head, refusing to believe it. "That's not possible." She smiled, an expression that was almost maternal, almost kind. "They tried to make flesh grow forever, an eternal life. Now the earth remembers how." As she spoke, roots exploded from the ground around him, wrapping around his legs like powerful snakes. He fell hard, slashing wildly with his knife, but the blade just sank uselessly into the sap-filled tendrils. The roots pierced his skin. The pain was immediate, electric, and all-consuming. His body convulsed as the vines spread beneath his flesh, threading their way through muscle and around bone, integrating him into their network. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound that came out was wet and low, a gurgle of mud and water. The green veins crawled up his neck, across his face, blooming through his pores like tiny, insidious flowers. The feeling of being a separate entity, of being Eli, began to fade. His fingers split open, and from the tips, tiny green shoots sprouted, reaching for the light. He could feel it now. The deep, slow, endless heartbeat of the forest. He was a part of it. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time had lost all meaning. No bodies, no survivors, only an endless, silent sea of green. On a table in the ruins of a cabin, a digital recorder was playing Eli's last log on a loop. The moss, it isn't parasitic, it's symbiotic. It doesn't invade, it assimilates. It wants to live through us. It thinks we're soil. The recording ended in a hiss of static, but it wasn't random noise. When a rescue team finally broke through the unnaturally thick foliage, they found no one. When a technician later amplified the recording, the static waveform resolved into a pattern, a whispered phrase, repeating over and over, "Grow with us." Weeks later, a new biotech startup appeared online, Verdantis Biosolutions. Their slogan was plastered across the homepage, "Healing the earth one cell at a time." And below it, a video played. A lush, impossibly green forest, waving gently in a silent wind. As the camera zoomed in, the leaves and shadows shifted, forming the faint, unmistakable outline of a human face. And then, its eyes opened. The rain fell like liquid steel, hissing against the glass dome of Dermatech's headquarters. Inside, the lobby was a temple of sterile white light, glass, and the soft hum of technology. On a giant holographic display, a smiling woman peeled away her old, damaged skin to reveal flawless, glowing flesh, a promise looping for all to see: regrow, reclaim, rebirth. I watched it for the 100th time that day. I'm Dr. Mara Kelton, and I designed that process, the Regenerative Dermal Lattice, version 3.9. It was supposed to be a perfect graft, alive, adaptable, and completely personalized. But perfection had a price. The test subjects. They started complaining. First it was pain, then it was memories that weren't theirs, voices echoing in their minds, and now they were silent. With a deep breath, I pressed my thumb against the security pad and entered the restricted lab. The pale lights flickered on, revealing rows of suspended vats. Each one held a figure, no longer quite human. Their new skin shimmered like oil on water, rippling in ways it shouldn't. I approached Subject 12. As my fingers touched the cool glass of the tank, the skin inside rippled to meet my touch, almost as if it were greeting me. For a split second, its surface molded into a perfect copy of my own hand. I flinched back, my heart pounding. Tissue memory, I told myself, just a simple reaction. But the grafts were never meant to remember. A voice from behind me shattered the silence. "Still beautiful, isn't it?" I turned sharply. It was Dr. Felix Tran, my former partner. His eyes were shadowed, his lab coat wrinkled and stained with something much darker than coffee. "Felix, you shouldn't be here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a chillingly calm expression. "Neither should they." He gestured to the vats. "You gave them souls, Mara. Every last inch of that skin is a living archive of the dead donor's memories. And now they want themselves back." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "That's impossible. Neural imprinting doesn't work like that." "Then why does it call my name at night?" he snapped, stepping closer, his voice cracking. "Why does it breathe when I'm not even near it?" "You need rest, Felix," I said, trying to stay calm. He just turned away, his voice trembling. "You'll see. It's already started." He walked towards the elevator, leaving a trail of wet footprints that seemed to vanish into thin air before they even reached the doors. That night I stayed late, haunted by his words. I pulled up Subject 12's biometric logs. The monitor pulsed with an irregular rhythm. The grafts were metabolically active, almost as if they were feeding. But on what? Just then, my terminal blinked with a new alert. Unauthorized neural connection detected. Connection? To what? Suddenly, every monitor in the lab flickered to life. Hundreds of faces stared back at me. Donors, victims, clients. Their eyes all blinked in perfect, eerie unison, and then their mouths moved, whispering a single, chilling phrase that echoed through the lab. "Where is our skin, Dr. Kelton?" The lights dimmed to a blood-red emergency glow. A faint scratching sound came from inside Subject 12's tank. It grew louder, more frantic, until a sharp crack spiderwebbed across the glass. I scrambled back, slamming my hand on the emergency lockdown button. Alarms blared, painting the room in strobing crimson. The tank burst open and a viscous fluid flooded the floor. Subject 12 stepped out. It was slick, gleaming, its skin shifting like mercury, reflecting dozens of faces that weren't its own. "Mara," it whispered, its voice a horrifying chorus of men, women, and children. "You're not real," I choked out, my body frozen in terror. "We are real," the chorus replied. "You made us so." It reached for me, its skin crawling outward like liquid silk. I fired the containment pulse. A blinding flash knocked the creature backward, its form convulsing, but the shock only seemed to make it angrier. Then came the groaning of stressed glass from all around me. The other vats began to tremble. One by one, they shattered. The room filled with crawling, grasping figures, their skin sloughing off and reshaping, merging into monstrous forms. The clean, antiseptic smell was replaced by something coppery and raw. I bolted for the exit, slipping on the slick fluid. The alarms shrieked, drowning out the wet, slapping sound of footsteps right behind me. I made it to my office, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands shook as I activated my private terminal. There was only one file left I could access. Prototype 0, Personal Trial. My own pale, ghost-like reflection stared back at me from the dark screen. I had tested the graft myself, years ago. Just a small patch on my arm. It had healed perfectly. No side effects, or so I thought. I rolled up my sleeve. Under the flickering emergency lights, the patch of skin shimmered faintly. I touched it, and it moved. A cold dread twisted in my stomach. The skin rippled, crawling up my arm in slow, deliberate waves. No, stop. I grabbed a scalpel from my desk and sliced into it, but the wound closed instantly, seamlessly. The skin... It laughed, a soft, wet giggle that I felt more than heard. "We remember," it whispered, the voice coming from my own throat. "You wore us first." Then the entire building went dark. A sound rose from the hallway, hundreds of voices murmuring in a ghastly sea of whispers. Something heavy dragged across the floor outside my door. The handle began to turn. I stumbled backward, clutching my arm. The skin had already climbed to my shoulder, twitching and pulsing like a living glove. The door burst open. Felix stood in the doorway, but his face wasn't his anymore. Layers of skin, some familiar, some foreign, overlapped and moved independently. His eyes were gone, replaced by glossy membranes that blinked sideways. "They want you, Mara," he said, his voice a distorted blend of countless others. "You're the first, the original donor." He stepped closer, the movement of his skin making a wet, shivering sound. "You can end this. Give it back. Join us." I grabbed the sterilizer torch from my desk. "Stay away from me." The thing that was Felix smiled with multiple mouths. "You can't burn what's already inside you." I lit the torch, and a bright blue flame flared to life. The creature screamed, 100 voices shrieking as one. The skin on its face melted away, revealing more faces writhing beneath. I lunged forward and plunged the torch into my own arm. The pain was unbearable as the graft writhed and blackened. But when the flame died, my arm was whole again. Not burned, not scarred, and not mine. The skin pulsed once, twice, then surged over my chest. I dropped the torch. Please stop. The walls around me began to ripple. The screens flickered on, playing my own research notes, showing the face of every donor I'd ever used. The very room seemed to breathe with my own words. The skin surged over my face, sealing my scream inside. My last sight was my own reflection in the dark glass, perfect, unblemished, and smiling. When the rescue team arrived the next morning, the lab was pristine, empty, no blood, no bodies. Just rows of sealed vats filled with flawless, unmarked skin, lying smooth and still, waiting. The system rebooted itself. On the main lobby display, new text appeared: Regrow, Reclaim, Rebirth, Dermatech, now available worldwide. For Lena Voss, her body was more than just flesh and bone. It was a finely tuned instrument. At 29, she was the star of the ballet world, the lead in Giselle, Swan Lake, and The Rite of Spring. Critics raved about her surgical grace. For Lena, it was simply survival. Her career, her entire identity, was built on flawless motion. Then came the accident. It wasn't some grand, dramatic catastrophe. It was a simple pop, a sickening tear, and a sudden, breathless silence. One moment she was soaring across the stage. The next, she felt the impossible twist in her left leg, a slackness that shouldn't be there. The stage lights blurred into a blinding haze. For the first time in her life, Lena Voss couldn't move. The diagnosis was a death sentence for her career, a ruptured Achilles tendon. 6 months minimum, the surgeon told her, his voice devoid of emotion. Maybe a year before you're back to full performance. Maybe never. Those last 2 words echoed in the sterile clinic room, a curse hanging in the air. Maybe never. She tried to smile at her reflection, but the woman staring back was a stranger. Her leg was encased in gauze, her perfect posture slumped in defeat. Without her dance, she was nothing. Her company, ever practical, replaced her within 2 weeks. The new lead, younger and hungrier, offered polite, empty smiles during rehearsals. Watching from the wings, Lena felt a venomous feeling, something far darker than simple jealousy. Twist in her gut. That night, consumed by desperation, she plunged into the darkest corners of the internet, searching for a miracle, for any experimental treatment that could get her back on her feet. She didn't care if it was dangerous, untested, or even illegal. She just needed to dance again. She found it in a nondescript grey building on the city's fringe. No sign, no name, just an address. Inside, the air was a strange mix of antiseptic and citrus. A man in a white lab coat, Dr. Havel, greeted her. His eyes were unsettlingly bright, almost feverish with excitement. "I've read about your work," he said, his handshake firm. "Your control is remarkable." Lena cut straight to the point. "I need to get it back." A slow smile spread across his face. "That's what this is for." He called it adaptive myocyte therapy, a way to rebuild muscle fibers using an engineered cellular matrix. This matrix, he explained, would learn from stress, evolving to match her own natural motion. "It grows stronger with you," he said, his eyes gleaming. "Think of it as evolution on a cellular scale." She didn't ask about FDA approval. She didn't want to know. She just signed the consent form, her hand trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. The first injection was like liquid fire shooting up her calf. The serum was translucent, filled with microscopic filaments that burned with an unbearable intensity. But Dr. Havel seemed pleased. "The reaction means it's working," he assured her. That night, her leg throbbed with a rhythm of its own, like a second heartbeat. When she dared to touch it, the skin twitched beneath her fingers as if something was alive inside. She dreamt of dancing, her body impossibly light, her movements fluid and perfect. In the dream, the floor beneath her melted away, and her own tendons coiled like serpents, pulling her higher and higher into the air. Within 2 weeks, the pain was gone. Her leg felt better, not just healed, but stronger than it had ever been. She could point, flex, and even leap with no strain at all. Dr. Havel watched her progress with rapt fascination. "The regeneration is exceeding all expectations," he murmured. "Your tissue is integrating beautifully." But Lena started to notice other things. The texture of her skin on her calf had changed. It was smoother, the veins paler, and the muscle underneath felt strangely taut, like braided steel. When she flexed, faint, rippling lines shifted under the surface like cords tightening in perfect sync. She told herself it was just swelling, a side effect of the healing, but she knew it was more than that. Sometimes, late at night, she could feel the fibers moving on their own, not just twitching but stretching, as if they were rehearsing without her. She began training again in secret. At first her movements were stiff and mechanical, but then the flow returned. The glide, the pirouette, the soaring leap. Her left leg was perfect, responding without hesitation. She could dance for hours, feeling no fatigue at all. But with every step, she felt a subtle resistance, a pull, as if the muscle had a will of its own, anticipating moves she hadn't even thought of yet. Reflex memory, she told herself, trying to rationalize it. It's just adapting. One evening, practicing in front of the studio mirror, she stopped to spin, but her reflection didn't. For a split second, the image of her left leg continued the motion on its own. A cold shiver of pure terror ran down her spine. As she steadied herself, the reflection lagged, then snapped back into place. In a fit of panic, she grabbed a stool and smashed the mirror into 1,000 pieces. By the 3rd month, the changes were no longer confined to her leg. The serum, Dr. Havel admitted, had migrated systemically. "I expected some cellular diffusion," he said, avoiding her eyes. "But this is fascinating. Your entire musculature is rewriting itself." She looked down at her arms. The familiar pattern of her veins had vanished, replaced by a fine network of shifting striations just beneath her skin. "It's alive," she whispered in horror. Havel gave a faint, detached smile. "In a sense, yes. It's optimizing you." But Lena didn't feel optimized. She felt hollowed out, a marionette whose strings were being pulled by an invisible puppeteer. Her body no longer obeyed her. It anticipated her, reacting to thoughts before she'd fully formed them. She began waking up in the middle of the night, finding herself mid-dance in her living room, her feet raw and bleeding, the stereo playing music she had no memory of turning on. Her body was moving while she slept. She confronted Havel, her voice trembling with rage and fear. "You didn't tell me it would change me." He studied her with a cold, scientific curiosity. "You wanted perfection, didn't you? This is what evolution looks like, shedding inefficiency." Her voice cracked. "I can't stop moving." Just as she said it, her body convulsed. Her legs began a slow, involuntary play, her spine arching with a grace that was entirely separate from her own will. "Make it stop," she screamed, her face a mask of terror. Havel reached for her, but her body spun away from him in a perfect pirouette, a flawless motion born from her own personal nightmare. She collapsed, sobbing, her limbs trembling not with exhaustion, but with a terrifying eagerness, like an engine idling, ready to roar back to life. That night, she tried to restrain herself, tying her legs to the bedposts with belts, binding her arms to her sides. She fell into a fitful sleep, whispering, "Stop, please stop." Hours later, her downstairs neighbors were jolted awake by the blaring sound of Swan Lake. When the police finally broke down her door, they found the apartment in ruins. Shattered mirrors, cracked floorboards, and smeared handprints on every wall. And in the center of the room, Lena was still dancing. Her body was contorted into impossible shapes that defied human anatomy. Her tendons had split and branched into fibrous cords that wove through the air like grotesque strings. Her face was strangely serene, her eyes glazed over, a half smile on her lips, as if she had finally achieved true weightlessness. When they tried to restrain her, the movements turned violent. Every muscle rippled with inhuman strength, her joints hyperextending with a series of sickening cracks that echoed through the room like applause. She only collapsed when her heart finally gave out. But even then, her body kept twitching for several minutes, as if unwilling to let the dance end. Dr. Havel vanished 2 days later. The clinic was abandoned, all records of the serum erased. Lena's body was cremated, but the coroner noted something bizarre. Her muscles wouldn't burn easily. They were dense, fibrous, and strangely resistant to the flames. And when they sifted through her ashes, they found them. Translucent, flexible filaments that quivered and twitched when exposed to the heat. Months later, one of Lena's old rehearsal partners was walking past their old studio late at night. She swore she heard faint music drifting from the empty room. Peeking through the glass, she saw nothing but dust motes dancing and spinning in the pale moonlight in perfect, haunting rhythm. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more content like this. Stay safe out there.